Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SHRC, or Carleton University.
Europe and Canada respond to challenges of environmental sustainability. And so we're going to get some perspectives really on two different issues, climate change energy policy on the one hand and water policy on the other. And looking at it also again from this perspective of multi-level governance in part and how the different levels of government react to these policy challenges in Europe and in Canada. So I'd first like to mention that this particular thematic research group on the environment is led by myself and by Inger Weibust, who's also on the panel. So I'm chairing the panel, and she'll be speaking. And we will start out with Professor Weibust's presentation, in which she'll look at issues related to multi-level governance and water policy. And then we'll move on to have our European speaker, Sibyl Steuwer, speak, and she comes to us from the Environmental Policy Research Center at the Free University of Berlin, which has been a very loyal and committed partner of ours in this project, particularly through its director, Miranda Schwarz, who's not able to be here today, but we're very happy to have Sibyl representing the center. And then finally, Matt Paterson, our colleague from the University of Ottawa, who's been a leader in terms of expertise in the area of climate change policy on a comparative basis. So we're very fortunate to have three very high-powered people presenting. On the first topic, Inger has published or co-edited a book on multi-level governments and environmental issues, so she's very well qualified to speak on this topic. She is my colleague from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs here at Carleton. So I'll turn the floor over to her to start.
Okay, so my theme today is comparing Canadian and European Union water policy, particularly watershed management, and the question is whether or not approaches have been converging. Short answer, no, they have not. So if we look at water policy and governance, this generally covers two aspects, water quality and also water quantity. And in the European Union, both of these aspects are covered by the very holistic Water Framework Directive, which was introduced in the year 2000. And the cornerstone of this Water Framework Directive is that it mandates river basin level management, including of water supply, and it attempts to apply the principles of integrated water resource management. And the system has been in place long enough now that we're already into the fourth reporting cycle in terms of meeting the goals that are set out in the directive. So this piece of legislation was designed around IWRM, and the overall goal is to restore all of Europe's freshwater quality to good status and to prevent any further deteriorations in quality. And it also acts to consolidate many previous EU water directives. So this was one of the earliest areas of EU legislation on the environment. So the first binding water quality regulations were passed in 1973. And some of the most important have been regulation from industrial sources, water quality at beaches, drinking water quality. Also, the Municipal Sewage Treatment Directive was very consequential. And complying with these directives has required investments by member states in the billions of euros. So these are not shallow commitments. In terms of the status of the Water Framework Directive, rather, as of 2016, we find that although there haven't been any major revisions, it continues to evolve. So the water quality standards, known as EQS, have been updated to add a broader range of toxic substances. And all of the member states are required to report on their efforts to control these particular substances. So this is a very stark contrast to Canada. So we're going from a system that's scientifically based, very holistic and integrated. In general, Canadian environmental policy is far less centralized than the European Union. It surprises a lot of Canadians to learn that Ottawa plays a much smaller role than Brussels does. And in particular, there's very little legislation or regulation at the federal level. Generally, you'd have to characterize our system as being fragmented and balkanized. The provinces have a great deal of autonomy, much more than EU member states do. And on the whole, the system is lacking in transparency and really very difficult to wrap your mind around. So if we look at the approach to water quality in Canada, the most important act is not the act called the Canada Water Act, because that would make too much sense. The really important piece of legislation is the Fisheries Act, and it forms the basis for industrial effluent regulations, although these are actually quite limited in number. And these regulations are implemented by the provinces. So one of the things that the Harper government did was to revise the Fisheries Act, and it now covers only fish of commercial value, not fish habitat. So that means that the bodies of water that are covered by the Fisheries Act has been drastically reduced, because the basis of the Fisheries Act used to be that it was illegal to introduce a harmful substance into any body of water that had fish in it. Obviously, the difference between bodies of water that have commercial fish in them and just fish is enormous. So this revision was widely decried, including by all recent conservative environment ministers. So there was a great deal of opposition to this measure. The Canadian Environmental Protection Act also has some implications there. In terms of requiring actual action by governments, it's much less so. There are the most toxic substances are targeted for virtual elimination, but as of 2006, which is the last time the list was updated, only 2 substances were on that list. So that's really quite limited in scope. So in contrast to the European Union, which has been regulating quite a long time on these issues, there have never been binding national laws or regulations on drinking water quality, nor on river basin management, nor on agricultural wastes such as nitrates. Furthermore, there have never been national standards on sewage treatment. So the European directive on wastewater treatment from 1991 mandated minimum standard of secondary treatment. So if we look at this, this map, there's really substantial areas of Canada, so BC, Quebec, most of the Maritimes, that don't meet that minimum EU standard from 1991. Coincidentally, secondary treatment was set as the minimum national standard in the US in 1972. So in 2011, federal standards were introduced. If they follow the timeline that's set out in that legislation, Canada will meet the EU minimum standard by the latest in 2040. There are, however, no penalties for non-compliance, and considering the enormous funds required for infrastructure investment, it's quite possible that municipalities will resist complying with this. So if we look just at water quality, we'd have to conclude that there's really no evidence that Canada and the European Union are converging in this area. The European Water Framework Directive is both extensive and intrusive, and the mandatory river management plans and follow-up plans are demanding. No similar requirements are imposed by the Canadian federal government. So if we look at water quantity, this graph is actually from the bottom of a water reservoir in Spain that was taken during the last major drought that they had there about 7 years ago. So if we look at water, the issue of water quantity in river basins, both of these jurisdictions have occasional problems with water scarcity or drought, at least in some parts of the jurisdiction. In both of these, irrigation is the single biggest consumptive use, and for example, in Greece, that's 80% of water use. So you can't really talk about these issues without focusing on irrigation. In Canada, this is particularly critical in Alberta, where cities compete directly with irrigators for river water supply. So again, the European Framework Directive covers this. It sets minimum standards for ecological quality of rivers, so you can't take all the water out of the river. You got to leave something in there for the fish. It also implements water metering and pricing. There's no explicit limits on water quantity, but there's an attempt to try to regulate how much water is taken. So this fits in with the basin level management plans. And so for any withdrawals from a river, they have to be authorized in the plan. And again, that recognizes the ecological value of leaving water in the rivers for habitat purposes. The Canadian approach is quite different. So surface water is the property of provincial governments. And therefore, there's no national measures on water quantity or river basin management, and we shouldn't really expect to see any. There's very little evidence of application of IWRM. The only example I could find that seemed to resemble the principles of IWRM is the Fraser River Delta in British Columbia. So we have a number of rivers in Canada that cross provincial boundaries, and all the big ones are in Western Canada. These would be the Saskatchewan River, Mackenzie River, and the Peace River. And in each of these cases, the province of Alberta is upstream. And there are interprovincial agreements already in place for the Saskatchewan River and the Mackenzie River. So here you see the Saskatchewan River watershed. So it's particularly the South Saskatchewan that has problems with water supply, and you have competition between cities and irrigators. So the main use of the Saskatchewan River is irrigation, but it's also, again, provides municipal water supply. And again, that South Saskatchewan River is very heavily used for irrigation, and the irrigators have priority water rights. It's known as FITFR, first in time, first in right. So their right to withdraw water for irrigation takes priority over the cities even the Alberta cities that are on that watershed. So in some of these tributaries to the South Saskatchewan River, all of the water has been allocated. So every last drop that's in the tributary is already legally owned by somebody. So the fish are left to their own devices. That's not to say that everybody always uses their water right every year, but legally they are entitled to it, and the fish are out of luck. So the body that governs the Saskatchewan River is the Prairie Provinces Water Board. And contrary to the sort of consultative participatory ideals of integrated water resource management, only federal and provincial governments participate in this body. And the core of the agreement is a 1969 formula that commits Alberta to giving Saskatchewan half of the flow of the river at the border. In the event of a drought, Alberta is guaranteed a minimum amount of water. This body is very obscure and non-transparent. Last I checked, it doesn't even have a Wikipedia entry. When I first started doing research on them, you had to register to access their website. You had to to look at really what are public documents. You had to provide your name and email. So really quite far from sort of ideals of broad-based, stakeholder-oriented management. And again, doesn't embody IWRM. There's no consideration for ecology and minimum stream flows here. So the Mackenzie River Basin covers an enormous amount of Canada's land mass, and there is an agreement over that. Even though this is in northern Canada, it's actually really necessary to have some coordinated governance here because the watershed covers the area where the oil sands are being developed. So the Northwest Territories in particular is very concerned about what effects that's going to have on water quality and quantity for them. So the first agreement took 25 years to negotiate, and it had no substantive content whatsoever. All the substance was supposed to be decided by 7 separate bilateral agreements between the provinces and the Northwest Territories. This process has been very slow. By the year 2002, there was only 1 bilateral, but miraculously, last year 2 bilaterals were actually negotiated. And this, to use a terrible pun, this really was a watershed moment because for the first time, Alberta, the upstream riparian, agreed to sign an agreement that was acceptable to the Northwest Territories. And the agreement sets targets for both water quality and quantity. And there's a monitoring program set in place for both. And the agreement was praised by David Schindler, who's one of Canada's leading freshwater ecologists and activists. So if we compare water governance between Canada and the EU on water quality, there's really no evidence of convergence there. We don't see adoption of IWRM. It is possible that the Liberal government will repeal that revision to the Fisheries Act, but even if things are returned to the status quo ante, that Fisheries Act was very limited in scope. Apparently I don't know how to cut and paste. There is now some precedent for broader adoption of integrated water resource management, but considering that approach governs all of rivers in the European Union, its impact in Canada thus far has been very limited. Thank you.